All right, so we are on the clock. I'm going to go ahead and get started right now. So we are here talking about equity and how equity fits into broader smart city plans and infrastructure. So just to frame the panel a little bit, I think as we're thinking about smart cities, you think about using data and technology to ensure the service delivery and access for all residents. But just building a smart city doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be an equitable city. And so our panel today is going to dive into how do you purposely integrate equity into smart city plans and infrastructure. I'm Elle Hempen. I'm going to moderate. I'm the CEO of a company called The Atlas, which built an online community for city officials and staff to help them crowdsource ideas from their peers, more easily replicate solutions, and build effective relationships to make progress towards smart and equitable cities. And I'm joined today by an awesome group of panelists. For time, I'm going to do quick introductions, and then we'll dive right into questions. I'm going to try to save some time at the end for questions from the audience as well. So we've got Isabel Whitaker. She has some really interesting perspective, having used an anchor park here in Atlanta to really spur equitable development and access. And so we're going to dive into that a little bit. We've got Clayton from Silicon Harlem. So he's really focused on connectivity and broadband access across Harlem, which is pretty awesome. We've got Maurice Henderson, former city staff, now at Bird, so obviously lots of perspective on micromobility and what that means for equitable development. And then also Michael Nutter, former mayor of Philadelphia, as a political leader in a city, obviously dealt with a lot of these issues in Philadelphia, and definitely will have some good perspective to share. So I'm going to start with just a question for everybody, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to be brief because we only have 30 minutes, but I think it's important to start by recognizing that building a smart city and an equitable city isn't easy. So I'd love to hear in a couple of words basically what you see as the single biggest barrier for cities right now as they're looking to build equitable smart city infrastructure.
Well, I can start. I think probably perhaps more than you guys had very little experience and exposure in city. I'm a journalist by trade. And so when I had this opportunity to create a park, I was really starting from scratch in terms of trying to navigate city government bureaucracy in order to try to create some momentum around this. And I think that that's a big barrier to entry. And now I'm in Memphis now, and I'm doing something similar with a community garden. And I wish that there was still, even though I know the cities are taking efforts towards it, more transparency on how things can get done and more just support for those of us who really haven't had much experience on the inside to know how to navigate.
That's a great point.
And from my perspective, to your question, I think cities have to really start to understand their citizens and how those citizens operate within the city in and of itself. Me being in New York City, that's a real challenge, and not everyone commutes the same way, not everyone is moving the same way or learning or any of this. And I think cities are not 100% prepared to be smart. People are already smart, so what they're trying to do is deploy what we call a tech-enabled city. And my thing is that tech-enabled city taking in consideration the variety of people that you have living in your city.
Yep.
You know, there's some that are public transportation only. There's some that might have a car. Are we really thinking about that when we look at our infrastructure? So throughout this panel today, I'll be focusing dead on infrastructure and how it creates equity rather than the divides we have certainly seen over the various industrial revolutions, whether it's highways, tunnels, bridges. You know, as a mayor, Nutter knows what I'm talking about, that can create divide. This next level of infrastructure that we're about to, embark on, the fourth industrial revolution, has this wonderful opportunity to be exactly as the title of this panel. It can be designed for equity. And that's what I'll be talking about. And I just want to make a quick shout out to my son who's here, Joshua Banks. He's my man. So I'm so happy he made it here.
He is so excited by that. So excited.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for the question. I think that, to Clayton's point, the human-centered, the people-centered challenge for cities is one that exists in every city globally. I think one of the concepts that I certainly learned when I was the chief of staff in Portland, Oregon, was where to start. Which issue do you take on first? Because all of them deserve the attention of the mayor and the city council and the city bureaus and infrastructure there. I think at some point, mayors who run for election talk to voters about their platforms, talk to them about the priorities that they have. That's really where we began. And I think where most cities begin is figuring out what that prioritization looks like. And obviously things tend to change and issues tend to bubble up and whatnot, but you really have to, one, be dictated by your values as a community, your value as a leader. That's gonna be sort of your North Star. And then the data that you're collecting, whether it's through APIs that are being created or other sources, or another piece that is informing the way that your public policy is being administered. And then the third thing, and I think Mayor Nutter would agree with this, your budget is your moral contract, your social contract with the community. It really is a value statement about who you are and where you want to go. And so I think those are some of the biggest things that cities have to work through when they're thinking about equitable design.
Awesome.
And I think I'll pick up on that particular point that Maurice laid out. I always emphasize with folks that the budget is more than numbers and words on a sheet of paper. It does represent your values. And then you try to combine that, of course, with their built-in costs, their legacy costs, their things you can't do anything about. And you ran for office and said you were going to do all these other things, right? So how do you integrate all of that? People will throw out I was big into bike lanes, sustainability, et cetera, and then you get there. And before you do all those innovative things, people still want the trash picked up. They want you to move that snow. You got to fill a pothole. You might want to put a couple drops of water in a swimming pool. I mean, these are the standard, basic. I was getting all of this before you showed up with all your brilliant people. So keep doing that, and then I want the new stuff. Yeah. With short money. So.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think we heard from everybody. Some of my favorite city officials and staff right now really think about smart cities in terms of leading with the need. That's kind of the catchphrase. And I think you guys all hit on it, that this idea of really listening to resident needs is important in being able to deliver equitable infrastructure, not just innovative infrastructure or smart infrastructure. And so what are some of the things that cities can do to go about identifying that one need to start with, or that one or two things that they can actually get started on, since there are hundreds of things you have to deal with at any given day? Kind of what's that anchor? What's a good place to start for cities?
Well, I'm happy to start. I have one recommendation for every city, every community, every state, this entire country. I have one obsession. Everyone should have a connection. Mm-hmm. Hello? Everybody hear what I'm saying? There's 40% of households in Harlem that don't have broadband in the home.
But do they have smartphones?
What does that do? You cannot get your homework done on a smartphone.
That's true.
You cannot get a job application filled out on a smartphone. You have to have broadband in the home. You cannot call yourself a smart city if somebody's not connected in the home. And so if there's one fundamental thing, you can look at all these nice booths and all these great ideas. If the connectivity is not consistent across the board, there will be people left out. Mm-hmm. And to me, I think it was an excellent question. You gotta have a baseline, and that has to be connectivity. Try to fly, try to do anything, shop. There's people in our neighborhood that have to push carts to a store to get stuff and then push the cart back when the rest of you guys are ordering it on Amazon because you have a connection. And yeah, you can use an app to order stuff, but I'm saying the fundamental thing, I have been lobbying Congress for a while now to designate broadband as a utility. That's how much I think it really impacts our lives on a day-to-day basis. And if we're gonna create this tech-enabled cities where it's supposed to improve our lives and make things more efficient, everyone has to be connected.
Yeah, I think, I've come to say that, 50, 60 years ago, battles were being fought, not just down south, but everywhere. People wanted access to a lunch counter. They wanted access to a job. They wanted access to housing. They wanted access to a better education for their children. And in the 21st century, you need access to that web. You need access to information. That is the equalizer. That is the great freedom. That is the civil right of the 21st century, is access to information. And then you can go about your life and do the kinds of things that you're talking about. And where that is not available, there is a built-in automatic inequity.
Yep.
Because I can go, I ordered something yesterday while I was in my, what's it, TNC? And then I ordered something, it'll be at my house tomorrow, right? That's the way the world works.
And there's a vested interest in this. And all these companies are missing out on it. There is an economy even in low-income neighborhoods. The problem is that it's being ignored.
Low-income folks spend money. Yeah.
Well, and what I'll say
They buy
is that
stuff.
connectivity and broadband fundamental, right? Access to information is key. What I think is really interesting is a lot of cities that we've seen really making progress towards equity in smart cities is actually recognizing the fact that people may not have broadband access, but most people these days have access to a smartphone. And so in the interim, while we're building out that connective infrastructure, being able to enable low-income residents or residents of any type to access city services more easily through a smartphone, through a tablet, building those kind of solutions into the city has helped to create access. So I know, Maurice, talk a little bit about the work that you've done.
I have to just say to you, and I'd love to have another panel and have this debate, because our kids get out of school at 3:30, have to navigate drug heads, gang members to get a Wi-Fi signal to use a phone.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's not, there's something wrong with us when we
Fully
think
agree.
that's good, that's okay, they'll get there eventually. No, it's gotta happen now. So yeah, I understand what you're saying, but if we don't push hard, we'll let that sort of okay thing go. If I took the computer out of your home and your kids can't get that, I think you would probably be much more on my side. As
I'm on your side,
so,
for sure.
So I hear you, but I that's for another debate.
We're gonna get you a panel by yourself.
Yeah, that would be good.
I think you've already got
Also,
there's some
I need
out there for
Wi-Fi
you.
at the park, so now I know
And
who
she
to
needs
talk
Wi-Fi
to.
at the park. I'm here for you.
So, Maurice, I'd love to hear your perspective on kind of, obviously you have an app-enabled, right?
Sure.
Transportation.
Yep.
So talk to us a little bit about how you've dealt with deployment in low-income communities and some of the cities you're working in.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on that, pointing to Clayton and the mayor's comments. I think for Bird, the company that I represent, for those who don't know, Bird scooters, you've probably seen them throughout the city. Some of the cities that you live in, we're in 120 cities around the world plus at this point. A little less than 2 years in the business. One of the things that attracted me to Bird, coming from the city and most recently a transit authority in Portland, Oregon, was this notion of addressing some of the inequities that have been institutionalized in the way that we have designed our transportation networks. And so for me, access and inclusion has driven my work, and in particular, transportation equity has been front and center for that. And so this new technology, this new mobility option is one that we're seeing distributed throughout the world, but particularly being made accessible for people in diverse communities, communities of color, communities of concern, et cetera. I was just talking to Isabel right before the panel, and she was talking to me about what the distribution has looked like in Memphis, Tennessee, for example. And it's been an equalizer. It's been a democratizer in that way. Bird and our competitors aren't claiming that we're going to, save the planet in that sense. But if we're going to do our part, I think to your point, the way that we've been doing that is to make sure that our vehicles are accessible for people of various incomes. So we have low-income programs for access. We have programs that don't need a smartphone, where if you have a phone and you can text to do that. Some of our competitors and ourselves are looking at cash payment options, so that you can recharge your account at various stores throughout the community. getting ready to roll that out hopefully in San Francisco soon. So we've been looking at different tools for meeting people where they are, understanding the needs that exist in communities, and from at least from our perspective, from a business side, obviously finding a model that allows us to scale, to be invested in communities. So one of the challenges that we're working on now is we've got lots of cities that have lots of pilots. Well, pilots have generally a finite end, and as a company, and I'm sure anyone who's in the business can appreciate, it's hard to plan when you're not sure, am I going to be able to run a revenue business in your community longer than the next 3 to 6 months. So that's one of the impediments, at least from our perspective, as we're trying to help with this equitable design piece or access piece, is understanding the city's values and plans going forward.
Absolutely. Well, and I think one of the things that it seems like keeps coming up is this idea of needing to partner effectively, right? From the public sector and the private sector. So I'd love to get your perspective, and starting at kind of the scale of a park all the way out to multiple, 120 cities, you said. How are you guys thinking about partnering with local government, and what are some best practices in terms of what are win-win partnerships that you've seen work to actually deliver equitable infrastructure to a city?
So, right. So I, for those that don't know, I created the first park in the state of Georgia, which happens to be here in Atlanta, named after a prominent Latino who was my mother, who was an advocate for Hispanic immigrant and minority communities in the late 90s and early 2000s. And as I mentioned before, I knew nothing about creating a park. I had no idea, other than I knew that her legacy deserved this sort of memorialization. So I could not have done this, having a full-time job in New York, without the partnership of both government entities and a nonprofit fiscal partner, which in this case is Park Pride, which I wish that they would go national, because as I mentioned, there are such opportunities in cities like Memphis where we could replicate that. And I was able to, I think, through my own tenacity and sort of journalistic instinct, asking the right questions, find advocates within each of those sort of primary entities and agencies in order to keep the ball rolling. But it took 10 years, right? So you also have to be committed to it. And that's not entirely fair. It took a year to get it renamed, and it took 10 years for me to raise the money to create what I like to call experiential symmetry, which is this is a park that's dedicated to equity for a community that is generally not used to the things that you would find in privileged neighborhoods, and that's why I call it experiential symmetry. And partnerships are everything. Like I couldn't have just done this, and I love my friends in Atlanta City Parks and Rec, but I couldn't have just done it with them, and I couldn't have just done it with Park Pride. And I had to, of course, also bring in the private sector as well in terms of funding. So it's really, you have to sort of be nimble, agile, willing to turn and pivot while keeping your objective as a lodestar.
Absolutely. Thoughts on partnerships?
Just slightly shameless, but more for example purposes than anything else. And Elle's much too modest to even really talk much about the Atlas. She's trying to be a good moderator. I think part of the challenge here for cities, capital is certainly one major issue. Whether it's the cars, the TNCs, without giving advertising to the two prominent ones, cars, bikes, scooters. We've introduced significant amount of additional players into city streets that already, they exist. I mean, unless you're creating a brand new development, it's an 11-foot, 12-foot wide travel lane, a parking lane, maybe a bike lane, which then they had to take away from the car side, which just kind of upsets them. I won't use the pisses off. Oh, I guess I said that. Yeah, so creates all that conflict, right? Now we want to have scooters and bikes in the same place. And so cities are struggling with the disruptors, right? The Airbnbs, the Ubers, the Lyfts, the Limes, the Burrs, go down the whole line. And how do you deal with these issues? And part of it is about being intentional in equity, right? So many, many years ago, but when I had my other job, we wanted a bike share program that served not just Center City or University City or, down toward the riverfront, but I want Black, Latino, white, Asian, purple, whatever, in West Philly, North Philly, South Philly, the heart of the neighborhoods, to have bikes. And so back to your point about, but everyone doesn't have a credit card. So you can go into a store, charge up your account, you have an account, you got a key fob like everybody else, and I tell you, it just literally brings me joy as I ride around in my car to see folks in these neighborhoods riding the Indigo bikes from wherever they're coming from, to see those stalls or docks empty because you know that they've been taken out. These have to be priorities, and the leader has to make a decision about how to explain to citizens why this is even important. It is that access. Those are companies that I work with. I mean, people are still, sending in checks or trying to get a money order to pay their water bill. Well, there's technology, smartphone, tablet, desktop, companies like Pay It. I mean, you can do it in the comfort of your home. And take that, right? Internet Essentials, which is, of course, a program with Comcast, shout out to the company back home, putting computers in people's homes, low-income children, so they can do their homework like their classmates, right? So all of these innovations, and lastly, on the pure city side, because, cities love data and we collect information, half the time can't even really do anything with it. And then you look at companies like Rubicon, collecting tons of data on the city streets. Of all the vehicles in a city's fleet, there's one that goes on virtually every street in every part of that city, and that's a sanitation vehicle. They are massive data collectors and can see all kinds of things going on. That helps you to run a smart city and deliver a higher quality of service. The only reason for cities to exist is to provide service. That's what we do. But you need data and information to be able to do it, then you have to invest.
Maurice, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the data partnership side of things, because I'm sure that Bird has lots of information that you're working with to share with cities.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on that, both the data side and the actual partnerships in the cities to the original question. That's been one of the push me, pull you kind of conversations with cities. Obviously, we as a micromobility company, there's a lot of data collected and created by our riders and our vehicles, and as we think about IoT and APIs and things of that nature, there's rich data that we're helping to share with cities. So, for example, Los Angeles, where our home base is in Santa Monica, in that market, we've worked with LA DOT, who some of you are aware, Salida Reynolds, and a number of cities around the country and around the world are now part of something called OMF, which is the Open Mobility Foundation, which is helping to set the standard for how we leverage this data, what this data means for cities, and how we can ingest it and then use it to help with our equitable design. And so that's one of the arenas, one of the spaces where that conversation's really been really rich. And for the most part, I think we're very much aligned in our visions and where we want to take this. There's obviously some proprietary things that all of us have that we'd like to fight for in our own ways, but we think that tension's a healthy one. Also, other companies that we partner with. There's Swift Mile out there now, one of the docked station providers that are looking to do charging and some API development and whatnot. The other kind of partnership that I'm most proud of that Bird does is really, as we integrate and inculcate ourselves in communities, is really being a place for employment. And so whether it's the chargers or the juicers that Lime have, those are entry points for people of sometime low skill or no skill, folks who are returning residents to a community. This is that opportunity to open up doors into a new industry where you might learn how to actually fix the vehicle, actually learn about the battery technology, learn about the data and how we manage that data. And so this opens up a whole pathway of new workforce opportunities that are important for the development of communities. That's the kind of data that I'm also really interested in collecting and sharing, and city partnerships and the community partnerships, the community workforce development organizations and whatnot. That's been a huge piece of our work at Bird.
Absolutely. Well, in Clayton, obviously you can't do broadband deployment without a partnership with the city and the private sector, but I imagine there's lots of intersection with economic development as well. So I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of how you've gone about building those partnerships to actually get broadband deployed, and then what does that actually mean for ultimately economic development in Harlem?
I like this question, partnerships. And some of you might want to write what I'm about to say down. That's how critical it is. If you love your community, you love your city, here are the 5 components. You can back me up on this. 5 components on what's going to make a difference in your city. And it is partnerships. But it's 5 of them. Can you really at least remember 5 one? We talked about the government has to be at the table. We talked about the private sector has to be at the table. You also have to have your academics at the table. The universities in your area should be at the table. You need your stakeholders in your community. That's your libraries, your hospitals, your nonprofits have to be at the table, and the citizen has to be at the table. So if you're going to create a real ecosystem that's going to move your city forward, your community forward, it requires partnerships. What has happened in the past is those 5 areas don't know how to talk to each other. So you need a 6th entity, which is what we call Silicon Harlem, but you need a Silicon Harlem that can interpret the language amongst all these 5 people. Be able to put the value system in that ecosystem so we're all working on the same page. So if you don't remember anything I've said today, think about those 5 components that you can pull together. And for us, we have attracted over $50 million into Harlem in the last year and a half because we built that ecosystem. National Science Foundation came to us and said, listen, they gave us 50 million themselves. We've actually attracted about 60 million, but they gave us that much alone because all 5 components came together and answered an RFP, and they said it was the first time in their history that they saw an RFP answered with the community being right in the middle of it. Awesome. And that made a big difference. So I hope that helps any of you who will care about your community, care about your city, pull those 5 components together and you be the person that can interpret the language.
And I co-sign that completely, because when I mentioned previously nonprofit, private sector, government, I don't really have the academic down, but working on it. Community is actually at the heart of that, I would argue, because you really can't authentically engage with any of those parties without really being the voice for that community, or at least knowing what to advocate for on behalf of them. So I spent a lot of those 10 years just doing recognizance in the neighborhood to find out what did they want. I'm not going to build something for them that they don't want and that they're not going to use. That's not equity. That's just a waste of money.
Yeah, absolutely. 30 minutes flies by, so we've only got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to challenge the panel in a couple of words. So what's next? What's the opportunity that city staff, that community leaders, that the public sector, the private sector should be thinking about in terms of building smart city plans that deliver equitable solutions and access to infrastructure? Big question.
Start with community.
Agreed. It's a tech-enabled focus. I love the whole smart thing, but it's a marketing term. People are already smart. We have to look at this from a tech-enabled perspective. There's nothing really new. In Harlem, for example, back in the day, yellow cabs would not come up to Harlem. They were too scared or whatever the case may be. So we used to have to use gypsy cabs. You call them, they're in front of your apartment within a minute, they take you wherever you want to go. We had Uber before Uber. Nothing's new here, people. There was a time when people couldn't stay in hotels. They'd have to call in and find somebody that would. We had Airbnb before Airbnb. So we got to demystify all this stuff, but continue to move forward with a tech-enabled cities, et cetera, so it makes everything more efficient. Your grandkids and great-grandkids will ask you a question. What do you mean you didn't see people when you talked to them on the phone? They're going to wonder, you know, all these type of things that are going to evolve, but it's still the same thing. We want to communicate. Yep. So that's sort of my brief answer.
Absolutely.
Besides the different form factors we offer, I think just moving the needle around education around this new device. I think like anything else, this is a new service that we provide. People are still trying to figure out how does it, match my world? How do I use this? And as we're seeing in city after city, this has truly become, interwoven with the way that people move around cities. So for me, education and opportunity that brings for folks.
Make a plan, work the plan, stick to the plan. I'm out. 2 minutes.
And budget.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Let's thank our panelists for a great discussion.